Thank you for joining us. I'm David Myers, a Hope College social psychologist, and I'm here on behalf of the Holland Climate Collaborative to talk with my esteemed colleague, Stephen McMullen, who's an economist and a professor of economics and has been so here at Hope College since 2014. He has a PhD from the University of North Carolina in economics. He has varied interests, among which are the connection of faith and economics. He edits a journal in that issue, and ethics and economics, including climate ethics. And so, Steve, I thought you might start by just giving us a little personal explanation of how, as an economist, you got interested in ethical issues related to the economics of climate.
Thanks, David. It's really a pleasure to be here and have this conversation for me. And I've been interested in these things for a long time. I've always thought of economics as a fun discipline, in part because it allows us to make progress on some of the big questions that we face as a society. And of course, the biggest question, I think, policy-wise, or at least one of the biggest questions that has been alive as long as I've been a scholar, is the question of how do we respond to climate change. Now, I became interested in environmental ethics broadly through my interest in animal ethics, actually. The two are very closely related, and so I've written about both. But climate change policy and climate change ethics in particular is just a great question to bring to students. And it's one that keeps coming up in the news, and it's one that we have to think about collectively because we have to come to some really wide agreement. And so that poses just a great academic puzzle, and one that I think everybody should be working on a little bit.
In my discipline of psychology, we have a lot of research on what's called the delay of gratification. Particularly children, and for adults too, there's a tendency to respond to what's an immediate reward, or to seek an immediate reward rather than to think of the greater long-term good and rewards for oneself. And it seems to me this is relevant in your realm of climate economics too. I mean, isn't there a lot of pressure just to do what's good for the economy in the short term without calculating long-term, what do you call them, externalities?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, it's a problem in the economics discipline that we could talk about, but it's definitely a problem in our political system, is that we have a government that is really good at being accountable for problems that happen over periods of months or years. And because of the turnover and because of lifespans of voters, it's really hard to come up with a broad consensus to sacrifice for benefits that we'll realize 50 or 75 years down the road. I don't know how to solve that problem, but it seems like a real institutional problem.
Yeah, so I mean, we're thinking about our own well-being right now rather than our children and grandchildren. We're not thinking into the future.
It's very true, and it's also worth noting that it's really easy to take the kind of uncertainty we have about what the world looks like 50 or 75 years down the road and use it as a reason for not acting, which I don't think stands up to scrutiny, but I think it does have a lot of political power.
Right. So I'm curious about an idea that I've read a lot about, and I'm wondering if you could explain it to us and our listeners, and that is the idea of a revenue-neutral carbon tax as a way to encourage a more climate-friendly future without a great economic cost in the immediate short term. Could you explain what that idea is and how it would work?
Yeah, that's great. I signed on to one of these famous statements by economists that came out a few years ago in favor of a revenue-neutral carbon tax. And I think there's a couple of reasons why it's probably the best policy going forward. First, it's just really simple. The idea is that anywhere that we're emitting carbon or a greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, that's the point at which we should also be imposing the cost that we all bear from the carbon or from the greenhouse gases. So broadly speaking, we're in the realm that economists talk about a negative externality. And what that just means is that we make a choice thinking about the immediate benefits, but it has some negative side effect for somebody else. And in the case of climate change, we have immediate benefits to us when we transport ourselves to work in a gasoline-powered car. And there's a really, really small cost that we impose on the population across the world and our children and grandchildren all over the world because we contribute a really tiny bit to climate change. So the idea is that we add the cost of the carbon, the total cost to society and to the whole globe, we add that cost right at the pump when we're filling up our gas tank, or we add that cost right onto the heating bill when we're using natural gas or in a coal-fired power plant. And so then we're taking the cost and we're building it in to the decision that people make when they decide whether or not to use gasoline or an electric car or something else. And this has a couple of neat benefits. First, it immediately gives an incentive for people to make more energy efficient choices, right? Because the cost we're imposing on everyone is built into our choice when we're using fossil fuels. And that all of a sudden makes more energy efficient choices look a little bit smarter. It makes more environmentally smart choices using less fossil fuels or shifting technologies, imposing some costs so that we can move to renewable energies. All those things look a little bit better because we're confronted with the full cost of our carbon-based energy choices whenever we make those purchase decisions. And
if I could just interject, I mean, this
by
is
all means, I could go for a while.
This is so interesting, but it raises several questions. One, is it an alternative to regulation, like trying to mandate fuel efficiency standards on cars? And as such, is that why Republican economists as well as Democratic economists are embracing it? I know Greg Mankiw, whom I've talked with, who was chair of the Council of Economic Affairs for President Reagan, is signed on to this, as Thomas Friedman of the New York Times. Is it politically doable, bipartisan?
Well, so economists have long believed things like across the profession that didn't end up being politically possible. So I cannot say for 100% sure that we could get this through, but of the different policies for engaging in a sort of a really aggressive abatement of climate emissions or reduction in our emissions of climate, this is clearly the best one. And, I think the reason for it is this trade-off between taxes and regulation. So notice what happens when we add the cost right in to the energy emissions. What happens all of a sudden is that these regulations that we have to impose on power plants and cars and other kinds of things to require them to be more efficient, all of a sudden those kinds of changes, they become automatic. Like people are going to want to choose them because it's going to save them money. And the neat thing then is the government doesn't always have to know what the right technological change is or what the right regulation is. And Congress doesn't act very efficiently anyway in this regard. And so what happens is we get a much more sort of bottom-up set of decisions, sort of pro-climate, pro-environment decisions that are really going to be more cost-effective, more efficient than if we try to impose those same rules top-down. And
how would the revenue neutral aspect work? How would you give the money back to people in order to help them know that they're really not, well, it's going to cost some people more, but it's going to benefit other people more. And on balance, do you give it back to them as a stimulus check, as reduced individual taxes, reduced corporate taxes? How does it get back to us?
There's lots of proposals and everything you just mentioned is on the table, but I think the simplest way of thinking about this is to note that imposing a tax on carbon would make people have to pay more for gasoline and for heat. And this is going to hurt folks, particularly folks who are poor. And so the solution is to take all that money that the government raises in the carbon tax and give it back somehow. So we could just imagine an annual check from the government. I can give you some numbers here because I worked them out at the back of the envelope. If we imposed a $50 per ton tax on carbon, which would be kind of in the range of what people are proposing right now, that would raise enough revenue in the US at current levels of consumption to give every adult something like a $1,200 check every year, right? So this is like Andrew Yang's universal basic income combined with everything the Sierra Club dreams of, right? And here's the reason this is a good idea, is because we don't want the climate policy to make folks in poverty worse off, right? We'd like to change the incentives for using fossil fuels, while at the same time making sure that when we do that, it doesn't hurt those who are poor. Now, folks who are middle class or who are anywhere near the bottom of the income distribution are going to come out ahead because rich folks tend to use about 3 times as much fossil fuel as poor folks do in the United States.
So it's on average, a regressive system.
Yeah. So if we just impose the tax, it would be regressive. But if we returned the money to people in equal checks, then what would happen is a kind of progressive redistribution so that most people would end up being a little bit richer, but they'd still have the incentive to conserve energy.
Right. And Steve, going back to where you started, conceptually and bureaucratically, it's much simpler for me at least to get my mind around than a cap and trade system. Yes?
And even more importantly, I think it's a lot harder for legislators to carve out favors for, for power plant companies and for certain states that need to vote on it, which is the problem with a cap and trade program, which you could dig into. We've been using those policies for environmental stuff for a while, but it's just so easy in those kind of schemes to give away big, valuable emission rights to companies, and it's just a lot harder to carve that into a carbon tax without it being pretty transparent.
I presume what you're talking about is a federal system,
Oh,
or could there be
yeah.
a version of it that would operate at the level of a state too?
That's a great question, and it definitely should be federal. Ideally, it's global. So one of the sort of baseline important lessons from climate economics these days is that the wider you impose these kinds of abatement policies, it's going to be far cheaper for everybody to limit climate emissions if we impose this broadly. Now, the best we could probably do immediately is the United States with an agreement to do something similar in Europe and some other richer countries. But ideally, we'd have close to global similarity in energy prices so that we don't have incentives for folks to be free riders or to move production to other parts of the world. And there's ways of getting around that with border taxes and whatnot, but it gets probably too complicated for this conversation.
Right. So as final question, as we're having this conversation, a new administration is about to take office. President Biden calls you today and says, Professor McMullen, I want you to be my climate czar. What do you do?
I suggest someone better. That's the first thing I do. No, really, I think there's two big things. And the first is a goal, as broadly as we can, we want that carbon tax, and we work with other countries to harmonize climate policies. But the second big thing is that there really is a good case for a really big government investment in clean energy infrastructure. Right now, we have solar energy getting so cheap that it's getting to the point where it's reasonable to invest at really large scales. And the same thing with wind energy. Right now, those are about 10% of our grid. And if the government gave a big boost, we could easily get solar and wind to be as much as 50% of our grid. We could invest in nuclear as well. And we could get our emissions down really dramatically if we were just willing to front the money now to make the very, very expensive transition. Right. And once we do that, our capacity to produce electricity would be much higher. That would allow us to shift over to electric vehicles a lot easier. And it have a lot of other advantages too. But it does take a big chunk of money up front in order to make that transition.
Let me just give you a personal example of the plummeting cost of solar and wind energy, which is a nice kind of hopeful note to close the conversation on. We have a family foundation that makes investments occasionally in private enterprise, private equities. And we made one, by the way, with some of this investing, we're trying to do good to the world as well as do well at the same time. Yeah. And one of our investments was a very substantial investment in a Michigan-based alternative energy company that was funded by the National Science Foundation and others to develop a new way of doing wind energy that didn't involve moving blades. I won't explain the technology. Mm-hmm. They were meeting all their goals. They were increasing output relative to input, and everything was going great. Eventually, the company went bankrupt, however, but I've never felt better about an investment going belly up, because the reason it did is because though they were meeting all their targets, the competing cost of solar and wind energy was plummeting so fast that it came down to the level that they were expecting to reach, and now they no longer had a competitive advantage. Another example, we made the money back happily because we, several years ago, invested it in a clean energy mutual fund that's invested in a whole variety of solar and wind energy companies, thinking that that's got a future, climate reality being what it is. And that just stood at $10 a share, plus or minus $1 a share or so, until last April. And then when it began to look like there was going to be a new administration, a new climate priority, and that stock started to take up. And then it rose more after the election. And then after the Georgia election, when it became clear that the Biden administration would actually be able to legislate, that stock now is at $32 a share. And so we've more than made back what we lost on the other. But I explain it just as an example of the very hopeful plummeting of solar and wind costs, which is going to make electric vehicles and alternative energy a real solution in the nearer future than I anticipated some time ago.
I think that's definitely true. And the bigger the investment we put into it, the more those costs will drop because we're able to manufacture things at scale, and we'll get a lot better at putting them into place and figuring out how to make them work. So obviously there's some technological limits still, but we're now at a spot where we could make a big investment in solar and wind really dramatically and move away from coal in also a really dramatic way that I think would just be an obvious step over the next 4 to 10 years.
Well, it's been great to talk with you. I mean, just listening to you, I'd love to be a student in one of your classes. I've sometimes said if I wasn't a psychologist, I would have become an economist. And now
I knew I liked you, David.
Listening to you, I'm all the more convinced of that. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.